It's Mother's Day, in case you guys didn't notice. So first of all, thank you for spending a little part of your Mother's Day with us. Second of all, if you don't currently have plans to call your mom or text your mom or whatever, if your mom is still around, then do so. If you're here with your mom, then thank you, first of all. I'm sure that she appreciates it. Second of all, tell her that you love her, okay? You can do that right now. Go ahead. Just turn to your mom. Say, hey, I love you. You're awesome. You're the best mom ever. Yeah, yell across the room. There you go. Now, when you come to church on Mother's Day, you expect to hear a Mother's Day sermon. There's a few issues with that in our case, however. First of all, is that I'm a contrarian and I refuse to preach the same thing that everyone else is on the same weekend that everyone else is. So if you're here with us over Easter or Christmas, then you realize that. Because I'm like, all right, well, I'll preach a Christmas sermon, sure, but it's going to be a weird text that no one else is using. I'm a contrarian. Second of all, is I'm really bad at actually looking at a calendar. So I was planning out my sermons and everything, and I was like, oh yeah, we're going to do this super cool series on heresy and how it still influences the church today, and we're going to confront these ideas that still float around. And then we started the sermon last week, and afterwards I went, oh, it's Mother's Day next week. And we just started a series. And it's not even a fluffy, light, nice series. We're preaching about heresy. And then we went out and invited people from out in the community to come join us for Mother's Day, and we have plenty of guests here, a lot of people visiting their parents. I'm just going to roll with it. That was my thought process. Moms, don't worry, you're not being singled out, because when Father's Day comes up in a little while, I'm going to do the same thing. Whatever series I'm in, I'm going to be like, oh, Dad, so nice to see you, and then we're going to keep going, okay? All right, it's just the way things are this year, man. But we're continuing our series on heresy, and this series we wanted to kind of ask this question. We wanted to ask, how do heresies still influence the church today? We were introduced to our president of the Anti-Heretic Club. His name is Tertullian, but at the end of his life, he may have become a heretic himself. Tertullian's life is fascinating, has more twists and turns than an episode of House of Cards. It's amazing. If you haven't read about the early church fathers, it's worth your time. Go ahead and do that. But Tertullian sent me a message. Don't ask how, because he's been dead for centuries. But he his carrier pigeon got a little delayed. Got here last week, and he said that I need to remind you guys the definition of this word, heresy, because it's not a word that we use that often, right? It's not a word we use all the time. So when we're talking about heresy, we have to distinguish it from people that just believe something different than us. Heresy specifically applies to people who claim to be Christians. So picture it this way. In the world, you have all sorts of people with different belief systems or lack of belief systems, different philosophies, different religions, right? So you have this camp, this circle, that is what we broadly call Christian, right? And these are basically just people that identify themselves as Christians. They don't all necessarily agree on what that means, but they broadly identify themselves as Christians. And then we might have another circle over here, people who identify themselves as Hindus, or another circle over here that identifies themselves as Buddhists. And so we have these different camps, right? Of different religions, different philosophies, different worldviews, okay? All these people outside that Christian camp are just people who aren't Christian. The word heretic does not apply to them, because the word heretic specifically talks about a certain type of person that claims Christianity, okay? So that's our starting point. We're working with the Christian camp. We're working within this camp, okay? Within this camp, there's a core set of beliefs that we refer to as essential doctrines. These are core ideas that if you don't believe these ideas, you do not align with what historically has been considered Christianity. So you claim Christianity, but your core beliefs do not align with that. These people, broadly, the term that historically has been used to describe them is heretics or heresy. So we're actually talking about people who claim Christianity, but their core beliefs do not align with Christianity. Does that make sense? And again, this is core beliefs, because there is a lot of room in Christianity for differences of opinion and differences of interpretation. For example, let's say that you are particularly passionate about politics, okay? Everyone was a couple months ago. Most of us not so much now, but it's okay. Imagine you are very, very, very passionate about politics, and you are convinced, you're just absolutely convinced, that one particular party, that's the party Christians should vote for. Here's the thing. You can't point to a verse and say, that's where Jesus says it, right? You can't. You can't point to a verse and say, that's where Jesus says it. So someone else comes along and says, hey, I understand. I vote for the other party, though. That person, as much as you may disagree with them, is not a heretic, okay? You following? Because it's a difference of opinion. It's a difference of interpretation. You're reading the same Bible and you're going, okay, well, I think I should vote for party A, and this other person thinks they should vote for party B. It's a difference of interpretation. It's not a core issue. Heretics disagree on a core issue. So, for example, who is Jesus? The standard Christian, the orthodox is a fancy word. The orthodox stance on that is Jesus was fully man, fully human, and fully God. A heretical stance on that might be, well, Jesus was really God, entirely God. Actually, he was just spirit. He didn't even have a physical body. He just appeared to. That's called docetism, and we'll actually talk about it in a couple weeks. You follow along? This is a core thing, because if Jesus didn't have a physical body, he couldn't have physically died, and if he didn't physically die, the whole grace and salvation thing kind of falls apart, right? It's a core issue. So when we're talking about heretics, we're talking about people within the Christian camp that disagree on a core issue. So they claim Christianity, but their beliefs, the things that they hold, are not Christian. They kind of disqualify themselves. They're kind of a walking oxymoron, if you will. That's what a heretic is. And we're asking ourselves, historically, what notable heresies still kind of linger? What notable heresies do we still have ideas in the church today that resemble these wrong ideas? It's born out of my belief that sometimes the best way to get a good answer is to look at a lot of wrong ones. So that's basically what we're doing here today. Our heretic or potential heretic of the day is this guy. He is a looker, isn't he? That long flowing hair, those forehead wrinkles, that stern I'm done with you look. The weirdly square beard. I don't know why that bothers me so much, but right there at the bottom you see it just cuts off. Like, you can't, no one does that. He must have had some terrific hair gel or something. I don't know. This guy's name is Pelagius. He was a 4th, 5th century monk, and he had some pretty interesting ideas. Now I say our heretic for the day potentially because it's kind of up for debate whether or not what he believed was truly heresy, whether or not it was truly essential, but what he believed was wrong, and I do believe similar ideas influence us today. So we're just going to, I don't think he'd mind too much. He's not around to tell me if he does. We're just going to group him in with everyone else, okay? We're going to talk about some ideas that he held, and we're going to see how they influence the church today. Specifically, we're going to talk about an aspect of what is called Pelagianism, because ancient people were really clever when they named things. What's his name? Pelagius? Call it Pelagianism. It'll be fine. This is an entire system of belief, and we definitely don't have time to go through every single detail of it, but the thing that Pelagianism is most remembered for is the belief that if any individual tries hard enough, they can live an entirely sinless life. If you've been around the church for a while, you go, that doesn't sound right. Because it's not, but we'll get there. Pelagius believed that we can live a sinless life. Now, one of the issues of studying certain ancient figures is that you can't always get information straight from the horse's mouth, right? You can't go straight to the person. Finding out information about Pelagius generally means going to the writings of an individual who very much did not like him and wrote book after book after book about how Pelagius was wrong. So you can see how we get a little bit of a slanted view that kind of feeds into was Pelagius really a heretic, or did this guy just really not like him? Who knows? But what we know about Pelagius, at its core, the core of his doctrine was the belief that an individual could live a sinless life. And that creates some issues for us. But Pelagius, I said this last week, heretics are not stupid people, especially when we're talking about ancient heresies and people created a movement within the church. They're not dumb. So we have to understand why they believed the things that they believed. And Pelagius, he was a monk. One of the jobs of certain monks, some of them would sequester themselves, they would just not interact with society. There were other monks that would actually have a public ministry, and Pelagius was of the latter kind. He had a public ministry. And so he found himself frequently when he was speaking to individuals, Hearing repeatedly this idea, I've sinned, but it's in my nature, it's who I am, I can't help it, so forgive me, and then I'm going to go sin some more, and then I'm going to come back and God's going to forgive me again. And so they're kind of like over here. Like imagine we have a spectrum here. These people that he's talking to are kind of over here, where they believe that because God forgives, that just means I can do whatever I want. If you've ever read the Epistle to the Romans, Paul does not like that idea, right? But that's something that Pelagius was constantly exposed to. And so he heard this idea, this extreme, this incorrect idea, and what he should have done is gone, okay, yes, like you will sin, that's a reality, but like come this way, kind of center yourself. You shouldn't be on that extreme. You're going to sin, but it doesn't mean you should like actively pursue it, right? That doesn't mean that you should just for the sake of it because you know God will forgive you, like Paul writes about that. Pelagius should have kind of helped recenter, but he does what a lot of us do. He's confronted with an extreme that he doesn't like, and he gets mad about it, and so he goes over to the other extreme. And the other extreme is not only can you do something about it, but if you try hard enough, you'll never sin again. You see, he's kind of overcorrecting, right? Like when you're driving and you swerve a little bit, it causes wrecks all the time. You swerve a little bit and then you overcorrect to the other side. Instead of centering yourself, you jerk back the other way. That's kind of what Pelagius did in his ideology. And it's not like he doesn't have any possible biblical support for what he says. Again, he's not dumb. This is a quote from Jesus in Matthew. It says, "Therefore, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." Before we actually talk about this verse or my experience with this verse, when you see a single verse out of context, go read everything around it, okay? When you see that word therefore, read what's before, because this is the conclusion to an argument, okay? It is dangerous when we take a single verse and take it out of Scripture, which is why this verse is going to be made sometimes to say something that it's actually not saying. Jesus says here, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. If you take it out of context, it sounds like Jesus says to be perfect, so I guess we ought to do it, right? Within context and with a little more understanding, then I think the idea is you pursue perfection, not necessarily that you can actually attain it. But again, you take a single verse out of context, you can make it say anything that you want. And so you hear verses like this, like be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, or elsewhere where Jesus says, go and sin no more. Not go and sin less, but go and sin no more. And you can see how someone starts getting the idea, well, if Jesus says it, if Jesus says to be perfect, if he says go and sin no more, not sin less, but sin no more, maybe we should live sin. Maybe he expects us to live entirely sinless lives. Maybe this is not just something that's possible, but something that is expected. You kind of see where this idea comes from a little bit. It seems, when you take enough verses out of context, it seems that it has some biblical support. Now, I said a second ago, I have a personal experience with this verse. There's a guy a couple years older than me I was really, really close to through high school. He went off to college. We kind of drifted apart. But I remember having one conversation with him. He was at a Christian college, and this verse had come up in one of his classes. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And also the other verse I mentioned, go and sin no more. And he's talking to me, and he actually espouses this idea. I don't think he realized it was Pelagianism, but he says, a Christian, if they try hard enough, should be able to live a life without sinning. Because Jesus wouldn't have said be perfect, and he wouldn't have said go and sin no more unless he meant it. And at the time I heard it, and I was like, I just don't know how to, it feels off, but I don't know enough. The dude's older than me, and he's going to college, and I'm still in high school, and so I just didn't really know what to say, right? But that experience has kind of stuck with me since I've learned about Pelagianism and whatnot. Because without knowing it, he's sitting here and he's espousing what might be a heresy. He's espousing something that centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries ago was declared by the church as a whole to be something that Christians should not believe. Learn from your history. This is the first lesson there. The second one is just that this idea still exists today. And while many of us wouldn't hold theologically the idea that an individual won't sin, we hold it implicitly. I call this Where's Pelagius? It's like Where's Waldo, but a whole lot more boring. He's also really easy to see because he's the only one in black and white. It's kind of gothic of him. Anyways, so where's Pelagius? In our lives, in the church, where's Pelagius? Where's the little Pelagius running around in our hearts? I think there's two core areas. One is self-condemnation, one is condemnation of others. Some people, like my friend, might hold in their minds, might hold intellectually the idea that an individual, a Christian especially, can live with no sin in their life. Some people do hold that stance, but more common, we have these unspoken assumptions, things that we don't name, we just feel, that are, if we examine them, a form of Pelagian's beliefs. The first one is self-condemnation, or at least it comes out in the form of self-condemnation. We have this high ideal of the way that we should live that is so high and so unattainable that when we don't manage perfection, we blame ourselves. Let me give you an example. When I first arrived at Bible college, they had this horrific exam that they made us take. It wasn't graded. It was just like let's see where you're at and what you know and what you don't know sort of thing. It was like 200 questions, and it was all like Bible knowledge and theology. And you're asking like 18-year-olds. So you're just like, yeah, here's a 200-question exam on Bible knowledge and theology. And it was things like they'd give you like half of a quote out of the Bible and be like, who said this? With like no verse reference, no, just like half a quote, who said this? Or they'd like summarize a theological position. They'd be like, all right, give us the name of this, and then tell us like what denominations hold this idea. Like stuff like that. And I took it, and I was like, I think I did okay. I got my grade back out like a 40% on it, okay? Horrible. And I was like, all right. A bunch of other people are complaining about how hard it was. Like, I'm sure other people did just as bad. So I asked my roommate, I was like, hey, dude, how'd you do on this, Levi? And Levi goes, yeah, man, I really did not do well. And I was like, all right, well, what'd you get? And he goes, yeah, just like an 80%. I had yet to meet my future wife. She would actually come to school the year after me. There was a girl that I was crushing on, and so I went and I talked to her, and I was like, hey, how did you do on this exam? And she goes, yeah, I really bombed. And I was like, oh, thank goodness, okay. She's dumb too. I was like, what did you get? She goes, yeah, just like a 75. And I was like, no, I don't belong here. That was my thought. I don't belong here. Because I'm coming in, and even at a ministry college, most people aren't studying to be pastors. They're studying to be counselors, or if they're studying to work in the church, it's not like in a senior ministry role. It's not like a stand up and preach kind of role that they're studying for. And plenty of people want to go into the secular world. They're just going to spend like a year at this Bible college, learn a little bit more about the Bible. It's a cool thing if you can do it. But I'm sitting here, I'm like, most of these people, they aren't even studying to go into any sort of ministry. And I'm coming here like, yeah, I'm going to be a pastor, and I know nothing. There's this thing called imposter syndrome, this idea that like you got where you were like just by pure luck, and that sooner or later someone's going to find out that you're like not good at your job or not good at school or whatever, right? And that was definitely like my experience my freshman year. Why? Because I had this high ideal of like, if I'm going to be a pastor, I have to be perfect, I have to know everything in the Bible. I should have scored like a 95 or higher on this test, and I got a 40. I had this impossibly high idea, and I honestly felt like I was unqualified. We can apply that same thing to our moral lives. Many of you guys are parents. We're celebrating mothers today. Many of you guys are parents. How many of you parents have never, ever lost your patience with one of your children? Oh yeah, you're cheating. He like this big. Give it 2 years. Give it a few months. I've been around babies. Give it a few months. Anyone who has had their child for more than a year, you've all lost your patience with your kid, right? Your kid probably remembers it. You ever read like a parenting book or heard someone talk about parenting, and they talk about how important it is to have two-way conversations with your children, right? But sometimes you just look at your kid and you're like, because I said so, that's why, right? Part of being a parent, because you're not perfect. Here's the thing. Some of us can adopt these ideas that we need to be perfect. If you're a parent and you have this idea of like that parent described in those parenting books and in the parenting seminars and all of that sort of junk, like that kind of parent is a parent that you have to be at all times 24/7. If you get that idea in your head, the next time that you lose your patience with your kid, what's your thought about yourself? I don't deserve to have this child. I'm not a good parent. My kid's not going to want to speak to me when I grow up, or when they grow up, when I grow up. That too. They're not going to want to speak to me when they grow up. What's your thought when down the road your child, who is now a full-grown adult, making their own decisions, living on their own, what's your thought when that child makes a mistake? What's your thought when that child decides, college isn't for me, and they drop out? What's your thought if your child gets into legal trouble? It's because of me. It was my fault. Probably wasn't. That's your thought, right? Because you hold yourself to an impossibly high standard. Now, parents, am I saying that you should lose your temper with your children? Of course not. I'm just being realistic, right? The other way that this comes out is condemnation of others. I feel like most people either suffer from one of these or the other, but some of us, we have like the double whammy where like we hold ourselves to an impossibly high standards and others. That's me. Let me give you an example. Condemnation of others, holding others to an impossibly high standard, feeling like they should live sinless lives. My wife and I are early enough in our marriage. I never tell her in advance when I'm going to talk about like us as a couple, so I'm sorry. We're fairly early on in our marriage, so we haven't had an opportunity to have like a ton of fights. And most of our fights were actually because she's a counselor. She's trained to be a counselor. And so she's always like bringing out the counseling tools on me. And so it makes it really, really hard to fight. It's hard to fight with your shrink, okay? It is. Because they know you. Like, she's just sitting there. She's like, yeah, get mad, Jason. I can disassemble you. But most of the time, she has these techniques for communication, and I've obviously studied communication in a different context. So generally, we're pretty good about like, I'm angry right now, like let's use these tools that we spent years learning, let's talk, like, and we're usually good at that. But we're still human, so occasionally it's just like, right? Something just blows up. So we've had a few big fights. And I do this really horrible thing, and I know it's a bad thing. I know that I shouldn't behave this way, it's like not good for our relationship, but there's just something in my brain that's just like, no, you're right, you should. The thing that I do is if we have a really, really big fight and it gets to the point where we're like, okay, like this is not productive and we're not talking anymore, I don't just like distance myself, which can be good, like go and like, hey, take 10 minutes outside, get some fresh air, go on a walk, whatever. I'll go and I'll sit like in a spare room or on the couch or whatever, and I'll be like, I'm not talking to her until she comes and apologizes. Like a 12-year-old. Like, for real. Again, parents, like you're like, yes, if you've had a preteen, you're like, I've seen that before. Yeah, like I know that's horrible. It's called stonewalling. It's a horrific thing for your relationship. I know that I shouldn't do that, but there's just something in my brain that's like, you're justified. You should do it. She should have to. But what am I doing when I do that? Because whenever you had a fight, even if the other person has 90% of the blame, you have at least some of it, right? Because a fight doesn't happen without two people. Anytime that you've had a fight, you have at least a little bit of the blame. So if I'm sitting here and I'm going, Maggie should apologize to me. She should come fix this bridge. She should come mend this fence. I'm holding her to an impossibly high standard that I'm not holding myself. You see the hypocrisy there? I'm holding her to a standard that I am not holding myself. I have this idea of like the perfect Maggie that she could never possibly be, just like I also have an idea of a perfect Jason that I could never possibly be. We have this little Pelagius inside of us that says either I should be perfect or they should be perfect. Those people around me need to be perfect. Or, for some of us, both. Where's Pelagius? In our self-condemnation and in our condemnation of others. Here's the thing. Everyone sins. This is the easy part of the sermon because there's not a whole lot of interpretation needed. Can I get the next slide, please? There we go. Paul writes this in Romans. As it is written, none is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Paul continues. He's actually quoting someone else, so he keeps on going there. But the message is pretty clear, right? Paul in Romans is talking to a church that's pretty divided along ethnic lines. It has a lot of racial tension in this church, and there's various historical reasons why it was particularly bad in Rome. But you have over here the Gentiles. Gentiles is just a fancy word for people who are not Jewish. And then over here you have the Jews. And they did not like each other. And now they've both become Christian, and they're being told you have to like worship one another and treat one another like family and love and serve one another. And they're like, not them, you know? And Paul's writing to them, trying to kind of smooth this over amongst other things. And his technique, I love this technique, is to come in and he goes, hey, Gentiles, you guys are horrible. You're idol worshipers. You're sinful. You're sexually immoral. Shame on you. Then he goes, hey, Jewish people, those Gentiles, they're horrible, aren't you? Aren't they? Yeah. But so are you. Because you were given the prophets and the law and you still ignored it. In fact, you killed some of the prophets. So you're pretty horrible too. Hey, guys, you all suck. Every single one of you. You're dreadful. You're just dreadful. But lucky you, Jesus still loves you. Like, that's Paul's technique here in Rome. It's amazing. He just comes in, he's just like, Gentiles, you're horrible. Like, Jewish people, Jewish Christians, like, you're horrible too. Everyone's horrible. If you're a person, you're horrible. But Jesus still loves you. It's amazing. Like, I wish that I could do that, but you guys would probably get mad at me. Actually, I'm kind of doing it right now. I'm just saying that Paul... Moving on. And this is kind of like part of his summary. This is part of that conversation. He says, no one is righteous. No one understands. No one seeks God. All have turned aside. Together, everyone has become worthless, and no one does good. This is really, really a downer for a Mother's Day sermon, but it's encouraging to me. It's encouraging to me. We'll get to that in a second. Let's move on. We'll get to why it's encouraging in just a moment. Paul continues on a few verses later. He says, for by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his, that's God, in God's sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. That second phrase, we're going to see a really similar one in a minute. There's a whole thicket of theology about phrases like this that Paul occasionally spurts out, with the whole idea of with knowledge of the law comes knowledge of sin, and what does that mean? And Paul, what if someone doesn't know the law, then can they not sin? And we're different sermon for a different time. But the first part of that verse I want us to focus on. By works of the law, no human being will be justified. You can't earn God's favor. You can't earn God's grace. You can't earn your place in the kingdom. You can't earn your place in eternity with God. That's like a central Christian tenet, right? But what does Pelagius say? Pelagius says you can live a sinless life. Pelagius says that if you try hard enough, you don't really need grace because you've never done anything wrong. And what does our inner Pelagius say? Oh man, you should be perfect. Or your spouse should be perfect. Or your boss should be perfect. Your kids, they should be perfect. You wouldn't get mad at your kids if your kids would just act right. You'd still get mad at your kids. You know why? Because you're human. And so are they. By works of the law, no one will be justified. What does Paul remind us of here? That everyone sins. Everyone. Every single person, with one very notable exception. And that's why I find this encouraging. Because we hold ourselves and others at times to such an impossibly high standard they can never possibly live up to it. We have this inner Pelagius that's saying that others should act right or we should act better or just things should be morally perfect in our lives or in other people's lives or both. We have this inner critic, this inner perfectionist. And Paul says, be real. Everyone sins. I have an idea that Pelagianism is like communism. This is not going to get political, I promise. Pelagianism is like communism because they're both beautiful theories that don't work. Pelagianism, think about it. Think about Pelagianism. Think about the theory of Pelagianism, right? The theory is that if you try hard enough, if you work hard enough, you can live an entirely sinless life. What kind of utopia would we live in if everyone lived an entirely sinless life? Well, probably the kind of utopia that's described in the book of Revelation. It's amazing, right? No sin, no death, right? This is a beautiful theory. The issue is that beautiful theories break as soon as you put people in them. Pelagian had an amazing theory, or Pelagius had an amazing theory that people could live perfectly. But with the exception of Jesus, there's never been a person who's actually pulled it off. It's a beautiful theory, but in practice, it doesn't work. Communism is also a beautiful theory. And think about it. Some of you guys might like or dislike certain ideas behind the concept of communism, but just take the barest, most basic version of it, right? That there's a certain amount of wealth to go around, and we're going to split it up to make sure that everyone has what they need, and everyone has a little bit left over for small luxuries. So basically, everyone has a house and food and a TV or some other small luxury like that, but no one's driving a Maserati, right? If you really like Maseratis, that's a bummer, but for the most part, we can agree the idea of living in a world where everyone has what they need is kind of cool. The issue is, whenever someone's tried to implement this, it has fallen apart. It's a beautiful theory. It's never worked in practice. Pelagianism is like communism. If that helps you remember this, that's awesome. If not, just ignore it. Just be like, Jason had a weird rant today, and then just move on, right? Pelagianism is a theory, a wonderful, beautiful theory, but it has never worked in reality. But you know what? There's still hope. A couple chapters later in Romans, Paul writes this. He says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin was not counted where there was no law. Again, that phrase. This is your challenge to look that up on your own, right? And we're going to pause there for just a moment before we go to the hopeful part. He says, sin comes into the world through just one man. That's Adam, right? Go back, read Genesis 1 through 3. There's this couple, Adam and Eve, and they're the first human beings, and they sin against God, and then God's relationship with humankind is broken. If you need a good summary of that, we did a sermon on it a couple months ago. But sin comes into the world, right? Adam sins, and then there's a really important statement here. It says that death spread to all men because all sinned. Now that's important, okay? He's not saying that you're guilty because Adam did something wrong. He's saying, no. Adam broke something. Adam and Eve, they broke the system, but you live in that broken system, and Paul is guaranteeing you that at some point in your life, you have done something wrong. I think most of us could agree with that, right? At some point in our lives, we've all done something wrong. And Paul's saying, because you've done something wrong, you're guilty. You have to pay the penalty. The issue is you can't. You can't. Because the penalty is your life, your eternal existence, your soul. That is the penalty for breaking God's law. You can't pay that. Here's the hopeful part. Paul says, for if, because of one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. We have an immensely hopeful message here today. We've been talking about sin, we've been talking about death. It doesn't sound very hopeful, but this is amazing because each one of us has this inner perfectionist. We demand perfection out of other people or out of ourselves, or for some of us, we demand perfection out of both ourselves and others. And Paul comes in with a much more realistic expectation of mankind. He says, hey, guys, just so you know, no one's perfect. Everyone sins. But there's good news. Not only do you no longer have to hold yourself to this unbelievably high standard that Pelagian, several centuries later, would come up with, but salvation is still attainable. Relationship with God is still available. Because there was one person who did live perfectly. There's one person who actually lived up to Pelagius' ideals, and this person was both fully human and fully God. And this person lived perfectly, but he still died. He still suffered the consequences of sin, but not his own, yours. And since this one man, this God in the flesh, Jesus, suffered the consequences of your sin, if you are willing to accept a relationship with him, if you're willing to follow him, if you're willing to live by the decrees that he laid out for you, you get a get-out-of-jail-free card. And that's a beautiful, hopeful message. Do you have to be perfect? No. Should you expect perfection from those around you? Of course not. But despite that imperfection, a relationship with God is still available to you. And that, to me, is an extremely hopeful message. Now, can I pray for you?